Well, it did work. It made me disappear, but it wasn't what I intended. Now, something I will mention, people who are coming in later won't be aware of this. You should have all received an email from me. Hopefully, you received an email from me today with a couple of attachments. If you didn't, and there's easy access to that, you don't have to have it in order to follow me on it. Having it afterwards, you can look at it, but it might be helpful if you're able to see it. Can somebody tell me, did you or did you not receive an email from me?
Yes, sir.
I
2
did,
attachments.
yes, sir.
Okay, good. Okay, we'll be looking at some of that this evening as we go on. Well, let's get going. Well, the last few weeks we've been talking about learning how to study in depth, how to study the biblical text in depth. And by the way, it was fascinating to me that while I was in this study, I saw this article popped up on my phone about I forget the exact title of it, but it was basically about a close reading of the text, and it wasn't about the Bible. It was study skills, and it talked about a close reading of the text, and it was emphasizing more, I guess, fiction, although it would equally apply to nonfiction. And I was surprised at how much of what was in that article are the sort of things that I have been teaching people about reading the biblical text. Close reading of the text is a good way to put it. It's an in-depth reading of the text, and I've said it before, but I believe that reading well is the single most important skill of a biblical interpreter or somebody studying the Bible. That can be easily undervalued, as if you don't know all these scholarly things, you can't really study. Well, but the single most important skill is just being able to read well. And when I say read well, it doesn't mean you can read the words. It's more than that. Of course, you have to read the words, but to be able to make connections, to be able to read a sentence and a paragraph and a section with meaning, and know what the line of thought is and what the meaning is that goes through it, and also to be able to see connections. I mean, for instance, we're taught in English grammar that in writing, generally speaking, the first sentence in a paragraph introduces the paragraph and the last sentence sums it up. Very often that's the way it is. It doesn't have to be that way, but very often it's that way. Well, that's just part of the skill of being able to read and read well and read with understanding. And when it comes to the biblical text, that is, I really can't emphasize that skill too much. Just the ability to read well, read with meaning, close reading of the text is very important. And that's a big thing that I have been emphasizing throughout. But there are, in this studying the text in depth, and you've heard me say it over and over again, there are two parts to this: studying without the help of other books, except the Bible and a concordance. And now we've come to the stage 2. Last few weeks, we've talked about that first stage. And tonight we're coming to studying with the help of other books. But before we go on to that, let's step back, and I want to ask you, do you have any questions from that first section about studying without the help of other books? Any questions that have to do with that? If it's veering off into something else, we'll see what the question is. But I'm interested to see if there were questions that were created or unresolved or whatever from this first section.
I have a question. I have a bilingual Bible, and I didn't even think until later on to ask if this was okay. I almost feel like I'm cheating because whenever I read um in Spanish, I feel like I get a lot more out of it. Even though I'm reading the same translation, I have a bilingual Bible in the NIV, both in Spanish and in English, and they're
Hmm.
side by side. And so I do that just, automatically. I always look so that I can get like a deeper understanding. I don't know if that is okay.
Oh, that's fine. Let
Okay.
me ask one question just for my own information. Um, is the language that you grew up with Spanish?
Yes, it is. It, it
I could have guessed that, but there's a reason I'm. Go ahead.
yeah, no, no, go ahead. That was all.
The language we grow up in, the language that our mothers sang nursery rhymes to us, the language that we first heard being spoken to us, that spoke of a parent's love and so on, is the language of the heart. And no matter how bilingual you become, there is something about that original language that touches a deep a deep part of us. As far as reading in English and Spanish, I'm all for it. One of the things I've said in the past is I think everybody should have a basic standard translation that is your basic study Bible. I think it's just healthy to have one that you keep going back to, and you get the cadence of the language and so on. And I think that's good. But I've also said, and I was thinking primarily of English, but it doesn't have to be at all. That let's say for most people, probably the NIV is the in today's culture. Probably the NIV is probably the. If I took a poll, I wouldn't doubt if most of you use the NIV. Not sure, but the NIV is as a centrist translation, kind of halfway between being very literal, like the New American, well, the old American Standard of 1901, the New American Standard, the Revised Standard in the Old Testament, especially in the Old Testament, the King James. It's not as literal as some of those others, but it's pretty literal. The ESV, and so on. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got translations like probably the best of them. Well, the best of them is the New Living Translation, but also others that are more paraphrased would be the New English Bible, Phillips in the New Testament, um, the Message, and so on. So you pick one of those translations as your basic translation, but I think it's also helpful to look at ones on the other end of the spectrum. I mean, if you pick the NIV, then read the ESV or the RSV or King James or New American Standard. And on the other hand, read something like the NLT or the New Living or the New English Bible. So, Carla, in your case, reading Spanish is like reading one of those others, and if that helps you understand more, great. And what I say about a close reading of the text and reading well in your case, applies both to reading English and reading Spanish. But Spanish for you has a certain advantage that everybody wouldn't have, that that you have. So no, you're not cheating. That's good. I celebrate that. Good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? It can be something very simple. It can be something that's more difficult. Whatever. Just something that occurred to you and that I didn't ever answer, or maybe I didn't even address it. If you think of something later, let me know. Okay, now studying with the help of other books. We spent time in the text alone without the help of other books except a concordance, and I'll have a little bit more to say about a concordance. You already picked up on how I use that. It's very specifically. It's not the way I used to use a concordance. When I'm in this kind of study, I'm using it in a very specific way that I didn't use it before. Um, but well, and I'll say a little bit about that. I've maybe already addressed it, maybe you're already aware of this, but when you're looking at repeated words and phrases, a really good concordance, and we'll have more to say about what that means, a really good concordance will give you all the words that in a document. Let's say you're studying Luke and you're looking for joy, which is one of the themes of Luke and Acts. Let's say you're looking for joy and words that are related, like rejoice. Okay. A very complete concordance will give you all those words. Now, without a concordance, you just read Luke and note every time you see joy or rejoice or whatever. But it'll save time if you use a complete concordance. In shorter books, you don't need a concordance. You've had exercises in some of the one chapter books of the New Testament that Charles Swindoll called postcards. He called Philemon, first or second and third John and Jude New Testament postcards, and add to that one book in the Old Testament, that Obadiah, and you've got those one chapter books. You don't need a concordance to trace through repeated words in those, but in other books like Genesis or the Psalms or Revelation, it really helps to have a concordance. We'll come back to that. So we've done this work on our own. Then we go, and this is without the help of other books. When we come to this stage of studying with the help of other books, I think of it as the more the merrier. Read everything you can get your hands on. And I'll talk about what some of those categories are. But basically, in this stage, you're going through the same process that you were going through in step one, but now you're doing it with the help of outside resources. So you want to ask the reporters questions. Now, some of the resources that you have will help you with that. You want to see themes, especially as seen in repeated words and phrases. You want to see the structure of the book and the author's purpose and so on. But now you're using these other books to address that. But you're also, and I've mentioned this before, you're also seeking the answers to questions that you had that were unanswered in step one. And I really believe there may be times when you don't have questions you can't answer, but I really think that it's real healthy. It's a very good thing when in the first part you end up with these questions that you're just not sure what the answer is. And so in the second part, when you turn to the other books, you can be part of your study is to focus on those unanswered questions and seeing if they have answers. Also, I've mentioned this before, but in this section, what we also do is we study the text in whatever book we're in, but then we can begin to expand the circle. Let's say you're studying First John. So you spent this time just studying First John. Now in this second stage, when you open up the other books, you also are expanding. What I mean by that is First John was not the only thing that John wrote. He wrote the Gospel of John, he wrote Second John, Third John, and I believe the book of Revelation. Revelation's different, and yet there's some application there too. But there are certain things in First John that will also appear in the gospel and in the other two letters, and in some cases the book of Revelation as well. Not quite as much, but there are some things that are the same. And so you expand from this specific book to other things the author wrote. Now, sometimes the author didn't write anything else or didn't write very much else. Jude, we don't have anything else he wrote. Hebrews, since we don't know who wrote it, traditionally it was thought to be Paul. It probably wasn't Paul, but the ancient scholar Origen probably had it right when he said, as for Hebrews, God alone knows who wrote it. It doesn't matter. It's inspired no matter who wrote it, but we don't know what else we would compare it to. So some of them, there are other books that they wrote that we can use, and some there aren't. So first you start with the immediate the book you're studying and its context. Then you go to other things that the author wrote, if he did write anything else that we have. Then you go to the entire Testament. In the case of the Old Testament, you're going to the entire Old Testament. In the New Testament, you're going to the entire New Testament. And then finally, you go to the entire Bible. And you're using what you find there, and it's built on the way you understand the book. If we go to this stage too soon, we may draw things in that don't really apply. Are you following me? And for the longest time, I would do that. I would bring things in, but I didn't really understand the context that they were coming from, and I didn't really understand the context I was bringing them into, and I was doing disservice to both of them because they really didn't fit together, but I was making them fit. I'm sure they do. This must be talking about that. And we can always have a problem with that, but we can minimize it if we stick with the process. So that's what we're doing here. Also, we add to this in the first study, I didn't emphasize quite as much the historical and cultural backgrounds. Some of us just know some of those things already. Without going to another book, we just have been exposed to them and we know them. One of the things that I encourage people to do is reading things about ancient history and ancient cultures is never wasted. It may not have a specific application, but it's sort of like years ago, I had a Greek teacher who encouraged us to read a book by Stringfellow Barr called The Will of Zeus. And he spoke very highly of this book. He said, if you could write a book like that, there's no end to what you can write that will be worthwhile. But it is basically, it's not exactly a history of ancient Greece, but basically that's what it is. I don't know how to describe it any better than that. But the reason the Greek teacher had us reading that book was, he said, and this is absolutely true, language is part of a culture. When we speak English or Spanish, or when we read Greek or Hebrew, we're not just reading words. We're reading words that have grown out of a culture. And the better we understand the culture, the better we understand the words. There's a thought that goes on behind it that so reading something about the history of ancient Greece, reading something about the culture of Egypt, of Assyria, of Babylon, those are not wasted, because there's a certain cultural context that the Bible's written in, and it addresses those. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the same culture. I mean, Israelite culture was not Egyptian culture, but after all those years of being enslaved in Egypt, you bet that they were influenced by the Egyptians. It wasn't positive, but they were influenced by them. And the more we understand that, the more we understand how, sometimes we just think, how could they so quickly start worshiping a golden calf? How could they do that? Well, if you can step back for a moment and think about what they experienced in Egypt, the culture there, then it becomes much more clear how they could worship a golden calf. And if we really think about ourselves, how many times are we ready to worship a golden calf, only we don't call it that because of the culture? So understanding those kinds of backgrounds, the history of the period, Egypt had a long, long history. They other cultures not as much, but the historical background for these cultures tells us a lot about the ancient Near East and what was going on with Israel. And then when you come to the New Testament, kind of the bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament are the conquests of Alexander the Great, and he became you might say, the missionary for the Greek language and for the Greek culture. Everywhere he went, he took Greek culture with him. And when he conquered the Persian Empire, he inevitably founded cities with the name Alexandria. And they were centers of Greek culture. And if you wonder why Greek became the international language in the days of the New Testament, you don't have to search farther than Alexander. Well, see, understanding something about that historical background is valuable. Understanding about where Rome came from and the empire that they built, and the Caesars, and the way they thought about power and the way they thought about authority. All of that, none of that's wasted. So, and we'll come back to that more. Now, one of the sheets I sent you is a bibliography of references. And in this stage, we're just opening the doors up. Go to atlases. I know when I was in school, I was so foolish. There was a course in Bible geography, and I thought, what a yawner. I was a Bible major, but I didn't think Bible geography would be a waste of time. I was so foolish. Great course. Wish I had taken that course, because there are an awful lot of things just about basic geography. You get out a map and you look at the typology, or you look at the geographical relationships, and a lot of times you come to understand why they did what they did. It wasn't an accident that the Philistines were along the coast. They were part of a group called the Sea Peoples that in the 1200s BC were a blight on the whole eastern end of the Mediterranean. And one part of the Sea Peoples was called the Peliset. We know them as Philistines. And they ended up along the coast next to Israel. Okay, geographically, that makes sense. Also, Israel, if you've ever wondered why Israel, it seemed like everybody beat up on Israel. You had all these powerful nations that attacked Israel. Why? Was it, did they not have anything better to do, or they just didn't like the Jews? No, it's because of where they were geographically. Israel was at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. To the north were at one time the Hittites, but by the time the people come into the land of Israel, you've got the Babylonians and the Assyrians to the north. And at different times, those one of those was the power. Okay, the Assyrians was the power at one time, and then they were knocked off by the Babylonians. To the south, you've got Egypt. Poor Israel was in between. And for those powers in the north and that power in the south to get at each other, they marched right over Israel. See, that's geography. So there are a lot of things that are helpful in just understanding the geography. Also, when Paul goes on his missionary journeys in the New Testament, to have an idea of what the geography of the Roman Empire was like gives us insight into why he went where he went, and so on. When it would be something as simple as Israel itself in the days of Jesus. You have Jerusalem that was the religious center of Judaism. But Jesus wasn't born in Jerusalem. He didn't grow up in Jerusalem. He grew up in the far north in a place called Galilee. And the Galileans were known to be, they were fiercely Jewish, but they were also open-minded, open to different ideas, is the best way I know to put it. And enough of that. I could say much more about that. But between Galilee in the north and Judea with Jerusalem in the south, you had the Samaritans. And again, understanding something about historically, understanding something about where the Samaritans came from, who they were, and geographically, when it said Jesus had to go through Samaria at one point, I think that wording is significant. Some people see it as less significant than others, but I think it's significant because Jews hated Samaritans, and the feeling was mutual. They basically hated each other, and for the text to say that Jesus had to go through Samaria, no good Jew would think he ever had to go through Samaria. They would go to the east and go around Samaria so they wouldn't dirty their feet. But Jesus had to go through. It's significant when he meets the woman at the well. Geography. I mentioned two atlases. My favorite, I'm not saying it's the best one, but I like the Oxford Bible Atlas. I've used it for a long time, and I really like it. Biblical history, we've talked about historical backgrounds, and I have two books that are ancient, history of ancient Israel. The one is written from a biblical point of view. The one at the top, A Biblical History of Israel. The one at the bottom, by Hallow and Simpson, The Ancient Near East, A History, is not written from a biblical point of view. It's not that they're anti-biblical or don't touch on it, but it's written from a historical point of view and is considered a classic. For New Testament, F.F. Bruce, someone said that FF stood for Fast and Furious. The guy wrote so much, and he was such a scholar. And his New Testament history has a lot of insight in it. Commentaries, I think we'll come back to those. I've got a bibliography on that, but I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. So I think we'll come back to commentaries. Concordances. Give me an idea. What translation do you use? Primarily.
King James.
King James. What else?
New King
Well,
James.
I'll start with that. In this list, I've got three concordances for the King James: Young's, Strong's, and Cruden's. When I was young, there was a preacher who told me that those were the three, and that Strong's was for the strong, Young's was for the young, and Cruden's was for the crude. I wouldn't say that, but I wouldn't use Cruden's because it's simply because it's not complete enough. Of the three of them, it's not as complete as the other two. And while I understand why he said Strong's, and there are some advantages to Strong's, the numbering system in Strong's is used in a lot of reference books, and it has that advantage. But I would still give the advantage to Young's, and the reason is when you look at Young's, what he did was, let's say you're looking for the word love in John, in the Gospel of John. He's going to list, both of them will list all of the occurrences of love. But Young will have the Greek word and all the times that's translated love in John. And then if there's another Greek word, which there is, the times when it's translated that way. And so even if you don't know Greek, you know that, oh, in this passage, it's one word, and in this passage, it's another word. That should be a tip-off that we're talking about two different words here, and they have somewhat different meaning. And if you look for the meanings, then that helps bring that out. So that's the reason, myself, I would give the advantage to Young's. Now, anybody use the NIV? I'm making an assumption that King James and NIV are probably the most.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I assume that there's some other people who also use the NIV, and I've listed here the NIV Exhaustive Concordance. It's very thick. If you haven't seen it, it's very thick. It's a big book, and it's exhaustive. If not exhausting, it's exhaustive. Same with the ESV Exhaustive Concordance. I would go with the exhaustive ones. And even though Young's isn't called that, you could call Young's and Strong's exhaustive too. They just didn't use that term. But I go with the most complete concordances because if you're doing an in-depth study of a word within a book, you want all the occurrences. You don't want something that just gives you part of them. Following me? I mean, if I'm going to be studying love in John or joy in Luke, I want to, or joy or rejoice or whatever. I want to know what all the occurrences are, because that's going to help me understand the whole thing. So that's the reason I would encourage that. Now, I mentioned how you can see that there are different words in Young's, both with the NIV Exhaustive Concordance and the ESV Exhaustive Concordance. There are keys to that. They do it slightly differently, but there's a numbering system. And and you'll see the list of words, but you look next to them, to the code. And like in the NIV, it takes you to the back of the book where they have Hebrew and Greek words and how that's translated in different places. And you can tell by looking at the key that's along the side of the concordance. Now, when I say concordance, does everybody know what I'm talking about? I want to make sure a concordance is just
Yes. Yes. Yes.
okay.
Yes.
It's just a book that lists words.
Right.
Okay. You want to know joy, you want to know love, you want to know righteousness. It's going to list those. But if you look, see what your particular concordance says. But if it's like these ones that I've mentioned, the NIV and the ESV, they're going to have some kind of key there that tells you what word is being translated according to truth or love or joy. And for the purposes of the way I've been teaching you to study, that's invaluable. Okay, any questions about concordances?
Yes, I do. I have one.
Sure.
I was told sometimes that it's best if you're using an NIV Bible, then use an NIV exhaustive concordance. Now, can you use NIV Bible which like strong, which is for King James?
With what? NIV with what?
Strong.
Oh,
now,
strong.
Yes. What I was told long time ago was that if your Bible that you use on a daily basis is NIV, then you're better off getting an NIV concordance.
In a general way, I would say whatever translation you use, get a concordance that for that translation.
Okay.
But if because of finances or something else, if you've got a newer translation, then the NIV, most of the time they're going to translate things the same way, but there will be sometimes when they don't. That's the kicker, when they don't. If you're using something moderate like the NIV or something more paraphrased, that'll be pretty good. If you're using something more literal, the ESV concordance probably will be more helpful. Okay. If you're using the King James, of course, you've got a variety of concordances that you can choose from.
Okay.
In a general way, I'd say yes, stick with the concordances for your translation. Okay, but you can adapt them, because I mean, how many different ways are you going to translate love? Now, it's true the King James, one of the ways that love was translated was charity, and you just in your mind have to kind of make the translation and realize, okay, this is it's old English, but it's this is a word that they use for love. Okay, diction. Any other questions about concordances? Carla, just out of interest, is there any sort of exhaustive concordance for Spanish? Or do you know?
The Bible that I have doesn't have a concordance, but I know that the Reina Valera, which is like the King James, most of them do. I do have one that has a concordance, but I don't typically use it.
Okay, just out of interest, thanks. Now, dictionaries and encyclopedias. The reason I have put these together is when we talk about dictionaries and encyclopedias, we're talking about two different things until you come to the Bible. Basically, a Bible dictionary and a Bible encyclopedia are the same thing. There's just two different words for the same thing. And here you've got a lot of choices. I've listed three. Some encyclopedias, Bible encyclopedias, are multi-volume, like the first one, which is probably the best one if you want multi-volume. Editors Bromley, it's abbreviated ISBE, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. It's got 4 volumes, massive. Okay. In-depth articles on everything you can imagine. I mean, it's going to deal with people, places, and things. And we'll have things like, for instance, you want to know something about Ephesus. Well, it'll have an article on Ephesus. It'll also have an article on Ephesians. Yeah, I'll say something more about that. I'll come back to that. I have high respect for F.F. Bruce, and Ronald Youngblood is very good. So Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary is quite good. If because of cost or shelf space, you want one volume, my favorite is the New Bible Dictionary. That's the third one that's listed. Just like the New Bible Commentary, it has the advantage of getting everything in one volume. It has the disadvantage of everything's in one volume. And obviously you can't spend as much space if you're writing an article for a one volume as if you're writing one for four volumes. Yeah, now I'll kind of sum that up. I think Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias are probably the most underrated biblical tools. People just kind of think, well, that's not really important. But let's say you're reading something about one of Paul's missionary journeys. Let's say it's Paul in Athens. Well, you go to a Bible encyclopedia, there's going to be an article on Paul. There's going to be an article on Athens. There's going to be an article on the Areopagus, which Paul went to when he was in Athens. There's going to be probably articles about specific gods and goddesses in Athens. There'll probably be an article on philosophy, Greek philosophy, and so on. Or let's say in the Old Testament, you're reading something about Babylon. Well, there'll be an article on Babylon, on the city, that will have to do with the Babylonian Empire. There will be probably either a general article or specific articles on different kings of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, for instance. So whatever you're studying, a Bible dictionary will give you a wealth of information about people, places, and things. And they are very much worth consulting. Okay, historical backgrounds. I've got two having to do with the New Testament and one old. The first one is Everett Ferguson, Backgrounds of Early Christianity. It's a wonderful volume. It's an incredible volume. Ferguson's background is church history, especially of I think 2nd century, but he knows the ancient world, and it's a wealth of knowledge about the backgrounds to early Christianity. The second one listed is Dictionary of New Testament Background. That is actually part of a series on biblical dictionaries. You can buy them separately, so you don't have to buy the whole set in order to have this one. Having the whole set would be good, but expensive. But you don't have to have the whole set to get this one. And this has articles on different things that have to do with New Testament background, and is very worthwhile. Then you've got Life in Biblical Israel. It's a bit more liberal than the other two, but again, there's a wealth of information about notice, life in biblical Israel. So there's an emphasis on what was daily life like. What did shepherds do? What did farmers do? How did women operate in the home? How were families structured, and so on. historical backgrounds are very important, I think, in giving the color to the biblical text and understanding certain things that went on in the biblical text. They took certain things for granted. They had a certain knowledge of their world that we have to study to learn. They just knew it because it's the world they lived in. And books on historical backgrounds help us get into their mindset. Okay, theology. There's the pocket history of theology. There's Donald Guthrie, New Testament theology, which is a really massive work. Guthrie's very good. There's Ladd, a theology of the New Testament. I like Ladd a lot. And there's Walter Kaiser, Old Testament scholar, toward an Old Testament theology. And what these do is they come, how do I put, sort of later in our study. Whether we think of ourselves that way or not, we're all theologians, which simply means we're thinking about God. If we're studying the biblical text, what are we doing if we're not thinking about God? Okay. But we're thinking about God and we're trying to put it together, what he's like, what he's done, by extension, what's he revealed about what he will do. And there are certain specific things, the church, salvation, Christian life, how you think about God, how you think about the Lord Jesus Christ, how you think about the Holy Spirit, how those all relate to each other, how they're all part of God. Well, fully God. It's mind-boggling. But I go to these after studying the text itself, and they help fill out details. Word studies. This can be valuable. It's a little tricky, and it can be a little difficult depending on what your background is. But the first one, Brown, the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology, it's 3 volumes. It is similar to the one under it, Kittel and Friedrich. What do I say about it? Well, what the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology does, it's user friendly for people who don't know a lot of Greek or any Greek, and it breaks things down into by English titles. For instance, let's say discipleship, and it's going to list all the words that have to do with discipleship in the New Testament, and it's going to talk about the use of each of those. And there's an index. So if you want to look up a specific word, it'll help you find that word and the discussion of it. Kittel, Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. The one I'm recommending here is an abridgment. It's a 1-volume abridgment of the 10-volume set. I had a preacher friend who said, Kittel's wonderful, but but when you're working on a sermon on a deadline in a week, who's got time to read that much? I mean, there's just a lot there, but the 1 volume gives you the essence without all the verbiage. Obviously, you miss something, but you gain the essence, I think. Alan Richardson, A Theological Workbook. It is moderately liberal, but it's worthwhile if you keep that in mind. And it's very English user friendly. Just look up some word that you're interested in reflection on God um, and the biblical text, and there's probably some kind of article on it. Then there's Vine's Expository Dictionary of the Old Testament and New Testament Words. Vine's is a standard, been around a long time. This particular edition was from 1997, but it's much older than that. New Testament Words came first, and then Old Testament words were added later. It's stronger in the New Testament than the Old Testament, but again, what you can do is, okay, you're since I've used this illustration before, you look up the word love, and it will have brief articles on each of the words for love in the New Testament. And it'll say something about how it's used in the New Testament. So it's very valuable. Okay, before I go into commentaries, questions?
Yes, it was my understanding that, back to the dictionaries and encyclopedias, it was my understanding that Unger's was a very good one. Is that so or not?
Yeah, Unger's is good. The ones I put in here, for whatever reasons, I like, but it doesn't mean that others are bad or that I don't like them. I just chose to
Okay. I was just curious if it was not as complete or something. So,
well, it's probably not as complete as ISBE, 4 volumes.
yeah.
There aren't many that are that complete,
Yeah.
that conservative and that complete. But okay, let's turn to commentaries. I suggest, well, yeah, I'll start out with this. I suggest reading 3 or more commentaries so you're not limited to one point of view. I like to think of it this way. I've already studied the text on my own. I haven't gone to the commentaries. I haven't looked at them. I've studied the text to the best of my ability and knowledge. And now I turn to the commentaries. And when I turn to the commentaries, I don't go there as a totally blank slate. Are you following me? I have certain understanding that I've been working on. Now, hopefully that's not set in stone. It shouldn't be, but I have a certain understanding. Without that, if you go to the commentaries first, then my experience is either you go and you say, bah, I don't like that. I don't like what he's saying. But you don't necessarily have a good reason to not like it. You just don't like it. Or on the other hand, you go to the commentary and you say, well, he must be right. He's a smart guy. He's got a PhD, or he's studied this a long time, and he must be right on everything. But when you have studied the text for yourself, you go to the commentaries from a different point of view. Because you've studied it on your own, I like to think of it this way. I've studied it, and now I sit down at the table with 3 or 4 or 5 other people, and we have a discussion. And I like to get 3 or more commentaries that don't agree with each other on everything. If they agree with each other on everything, just read one. You don't need 3. I want a clash of opinions. I want this one to interpret something that way, and this one that way, and this one that way, and I bring myself to it, and I'm joining in the conversation. And we do it humbly, but also we've worked on this ourselves, so we're not totally unknowledgeable, for lack of a better term. So with the commentary, sometimes you'll say, well, he's off because I studied this, I looked at this, and what he sings off. Sort of like that grand old preacher Marshall Keeble used to say, the Bible sheds a lot of light on these commentaries. Sometimes you'll read one and you'll say, no, he missed it, but it's because you've studied it, okay? But other times you'll read the commentary and you'll say, I missed it. I missed that. I didn't see it. I didn't know that historical background, or I didn't know that word meaning, or I didn't, whatever. And so sometimes you'll correct the commentaries in your mind, and sometimes they'll correct you. But there's a dialogue. You don't have to agree with everything a commentator says in order to benefit. And I'm glad, because I don't know any commentaries where I totally agree with everything. But I can benefit from them even if I disagree on certain points. My own standard is, if somebody takes the biblical text seriously, I'll read them. I may not agree with them all the time, but I'll read them. They're worth considering. They're worth being in a dialogue with. If they don't take the biblical text seriously, I don't have time for them. Too much to do. So much to do, so little time, and so I just don't have time to waste. Now, something that's valuable is to know there are different kinds of commentaries, and they're written for different purposes. For instance, some commentaries are popular level, some are mid-level, and some are advanced. Popular level means anybody can read them. You don't have to have any in-depth biblical knowledge or knowledge of the languages or knowledge of the culture or anything. Really, nothing's assumed. Popular level commentaries, like all other commentaries, some of them are very good, some of them are very bad. Some of them just aren't very worthwhile. They're just kind of a surfacey restating of the text without, or worse, they distort the text, okay? But some of them are very good. Some popular level commentaries are written by genuine scholars who can write really in-depth stuff about the text, but they have chosen to write something that anybody can understand. Okay, popular level. Then there's mid-level. In mid-level commentaries, you've got somebody who has obviously studied the Hebrew and Greek text and understands the theology of the text and the historical backgrounds and all that, but they don't dump it all on you. It's heavier than the popular level. Oh, by the way, popular level, there was a series called A Layman's Bible Commentary. They were little paperbacks. I don't think they're in print anymore. If you look around, you can find some of them used. One of my favorite commentaries was by Ralph Martin, called Where the Action Is, on the Gospel of Mark. Wonderful. Popular level. But he showed such knowledge and depth of Mark, but on a very, very accessible level. Another well, I guess you'd say popular level. He probably illustrates more than one thing, but would be William Barclay's New Testament. It's not exactly a commentary, but it's sort of a commentary. And he's more liberal. As in, he questions at least some of the miracles. And I don't agree with him at all, but he illustrates something else too, but we'll come back to that. And you got mid-level. An example of mid-level would be the New International Old Testament and the New International New Testament commentary. I may not have that title exact. The New International Old Testament commentaries and the New International New Testament commentaries. Those are mid-level. the ones who write in those obviously have real depth of understanding and know the original text, but you don't have to know all the Greek words and Hebrew words in order to follow their line of thought and understand them. You just need to work a little harder than you do for popular level. Then you've got advanced. That's where you get hit with the heavy Hebrew and Greek and heavier theology and heavier biblical backgrounds. I would suggest looking at some of those. Well, an example of that would be it sort of combines them, but the word biblical commentaries kind of combine them. They have sections that are easy enough for anybody to understand, and then they've got ones that are pretty heavy in the original languages. But also the New International Greek New Testament is a series of New Testament commentaries. Some of them are very thick on all the books of the New Testament. And some of those are just incredibly good, but there's a lot of depth to them. I wouldn't count them out, even if you don't know Hebrew and Greek. I would see if you could get a hold of one of them and look at it and see how much you can learn. I was using commentaries that were heavy in Hebrew and Greek before I ever took Greek or knew anything about Hebrew or Greek, either one. And I was able to get something out of them. You can't get all the depth because they assume you know certain things that you just don't know. But you could still get quite a bit from them. And I'll come back to, and some of them kind of bridge the gap. Some of them have written in-depth commentaries based in the Hebrew and Greek, and you need to know Hebrew and Greek to understand it. But then they put out one that's more mid-level or in some cases almost popular level by cutting out all the heavy stuff and giving you the essence. And that's worthwhile. So there are those three. Another way to look at commentaries is some of them are exegetical, and that's what we've been talking about with these. Serious study of the text. Some are homiletical. They're geared toward preaching, either because they're actually sermons in a written form or because they're written for preachers. The interpretation, there's a set called interpretation, that's for preachers. William Barclay used to be very popular among preachers. I don't know if it still is or not, but it was at one time. But also at one time, the idea of buying books of sermons was really popular among Christians. It's not now. It doesn't mean that they don't do it anymore. They don't put out books of sermons, but they don't call them that. At least not in my experience. They call them on some theme, but if you look closely, you say, these are sermons. Okay. They got all the marks of a sermon, but he's not calling them sermons. So you've got that. Then you've got, I would also say, you've got devotional. Devotional's heavy on heart language and application. Unfortunately, devotional very often lends itself to a weak treatment of the text. It doesn't have to, but it just seems like very often it does. These aren't exactly devotional. This maybe is another category, and that would be application. The NIV application commentaries is something that's heavy on application. It doesn't mean that they don't deal with the biblical text. In fact, they'll have a section on the meaning of the ancient text, on what it means today, and on its application. The emphasis is on application, but they give you the whole thing, and some of them are very good. Some of them aren't that good, but some of them are pretty good. Now let's look at some of the commentaries in my list. I'm not going to go through it commentary by commentary, but in the bibliography that I have of recommended biblical commentaries, I start off with my favorite one-volume commentary. Again, this is not to say it's the only good commentary or anything. It's just, I think it's a great one volume. The New Bible Commentary, edited by Carson, French, Motyer, and Wenham. It's thick. It's a big book, and you've got commentaries on every book of the Bible, and articles also about the Old and New Testament. One of the things I like about the book is a lot of these commentaries are written by people who wrote a whole commentary on that same book, and they've given you the essence of it in the one volume. A one volume commentary has both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is, well, maybe more than one advantage. It's cheaper than buying a million commentaries. And it has the advantages of giving you everything, a commentary on every book of the Bible in one volume. It has the disadvantage of it's one volume, and you can't go into the same depth in Ephesians when you're writing a commentary in one volume as if you're writing a whole commentary, a standalone commentary on it. But as a, how do I want to put it, as kind of the backbone for a personal biblical library, I think you couldn't do much better than the New Bible Commentary. Then in my list, I list more or less chronological order. Sometimes there are things that are combined that take it out of that a little bit. Well, I say chronological biblical order. And I try to list, I've tried to list more than one commentary for the different books. If I just don't have another one that I'd recommend, I leave it out. But otherwise, I've tried to list at least something on everything. There's some very good commentaries in here, and I'll highlight something that I mentioned earlier. In the New Testament, this would be on the third page at the bottom. You've got commentary by Matthew, or on Matthew, by Davies and Allison. Matthew, a shorter commentary. They wrote a 3-volume work on Matthew, and this is one volume. It is a shorter commentary. What they did, they cut out the heavy Greek and other things, and they combined it into one volume. But you get the essence of their argument there. You also see the same thing. Let's see, where is it? Yeah, the top of what would be the top of the 5th page. Cranfield, commentary on Romans. He wrote 2 volumes on Romans, but in this one, this is an abridged volume, and he boiled everything down to one volume. So you get the essence of what he's saying. You don't get all the depth, but you do get the essence of it. And I like Cranfield. Cranfield and Moo are 2 of the best commentaries on Romans. Neither one of them is perfect, but I think they're both very good. And one other example of what I'm talking about is at the bottom of the next to the last page. Beale, Beale, the book of Revelation. And this is in the New International Greek New Testament, which I mentioned earlier, heavy in Greek. And I don't have it listed here. In fact, this list at some point needs to be updated, but I haven't done it yet. But somebody, I don't think it was Beale himself, but somebody took Beale's commentary, and which is a big commentary, okay, on Revelation, and it's wonderful. Even if you don't agree with his basic interpretation, the information that he brings to bear is just incredible. And even people who disagree with his interpretation agree that it's probably the best commentary on Revelation, just from the sheer amount of information he's got in it. But somebody took that and boiled it down into a much smaller commentary that's much more manageable. So sometimes you'll have that. I like the idea of three. I don't know where I came up with three. Maybe it's because of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I don't know, but I came up with three. But I like to say at least three. More the merrier. I like to get a wide variety of interpretations, and three gives me a pretty good one, and it's pretty manageable, I find. Now, if you're studying something and you can't come up with three, there is something that helps, even if you have three or more. Some commentaries are very good at laying out all the options when you've got a difficult interpretation. Here's a possibility, here's a possibility, here's a possibility, here's a possibility. This is the one I think's right. Okay. Some of them are very good at laying out the options and being fair. Okay, it's one thing to lay out the options and not be fair. I don't like these, and it's pretty obvious I don't like them. You don't have to read very hard to realize that I'm attacking them. But some of them do a very good job of trying to explain them as the advocates would explain them, and then saying, but this is what I think is the correct interpretation, here's why. So if you can't read three or more, find one that does a good job of laying out the interpretations, and that will be helpful. Let me see what else. I was going to say something else about that.
I have a question,
Yes.
because none of mine are on your list. So when I was first starting the ministry, I bought the whole book on Matthew Henry, with all of his commentary. Bought Easton's, and I also have Holman's Atlas Bible.
What was that last one?
Holman.
Oh yeah, okay.
So I got Easton's. That was the first series of books that I bought when I first started in ministry. That I was told to get. So just your thoughts on
Those
those
are good. You will hear me occasionally. You may hear me quoting Matthew Henry. The commentaries I have on this list tend to be, how do I want to put it? There's something to be. It's finding things in balance, I guess, is what I want to say. There's a place in reading the older commentaries. In fact, some older than Matthew Henry. One of my favorite commentators, which I did not put on this list at all, is John Chrysostom, which was he preached and wrote in the 300s. Okay, so you're talking about older even than Matthew Henry. but he had incredible insight, I think, into the biblical text. And so I'm all for reading those too, but I wouldn't do that exclusively, because a lot of discoveries have been made as far as languages, culture, and other things that you don't get, sometimes don't get from the older commentators. You get something from them you don't get from the newer ones, but it goes both ways. So I think Matthew Henry is worthwhile, but he's probably more worthwhile if you then pair him with a couple of 3 other commentaries, some of which are newer, so that you're trying to get the best of the new and the old, if that makes sense.
Right. I've purchased some other ones based on getting commentaries based on, if I was studying the whole book at that time, I would just go by that one commentary for that one book that I was looking at. I may have 2 or 3 of those. Unfortunately, all those are in boxes right now since we moved. But I'm working on getting me a new bookshelf so I can put those up. But yeah, I just happen to have those 3 handy right now that are out,
Good.
quick and efficient. So
See, there are a lot of things that are worthwhile that are older, and a lot of things that are worthwhile that are newer. We don't have to limit ourselves. But this also reminded me something I wanted to say. Now, if you're a book fanatic like me, then that's one thing. But if you're not, or just don't want to spend that much money, that's a real issue. With my books, I think about, I don't remember his name, but there was this country western singer years and years ago that was asked how many guitars he owned. And he said, I really don't know, because I never bring them home at all at once, because if I did, my wife would divorce me. And my wife has been very patient, basically, about my books, but I'm a book fanatic. But if you want to cut down on cost of books, I would still suggest, and it's something that I've done, if you're teaching a book, or maybe you're in some kind of ministry where you're preaching, but if you're teaching a book, I always like to buy something new to give me a different perspective than I've had before. But there are ways around buying, if finances or if space is an issue, and that is, there are libraries. You can I would check out the public libraries. They're usually not very good for biblical stuff, but you can be surprised. Every once in a while, there may be something. But in Houston, we have a number of theological schools. One of them, I mean, there are a lot of schools here, so, but most of them I think, would allow you to come in. What I'm thinking of right now, you could come in on a visitor's pass and use the book there. You might not be able to check it out, but you could use it. You could use it right there. So if you wanted to go and read a commentary, or read commentaries or other books that are on this list, you could do that. Also, some of these things, especially the older ones, are online, and I should have included that. I will look around. I somewhere I have a list of. Yes, I'll come back to Lanier. Carla's mentioned Lanier Theological Library. I don't know if you are familiar with that. It's north of us, and you can't check things out, but you can use things there. It's incredible. I mean, it is an incredible theological library, and it's free. Like I said, you can't check things out. You have to use them there. But I've never done this, but I have a friend who who goes there regularly, and you can actually, in effect, reserve books that you're reading. So while you can't take them from the library, you can read them there, and you can actually put basically a hold or a reserve on them, so that if you go one week and then you go the next week, you can go to the desk and pick it up and keep reading. So it's a very good resource. Well, I have also used, and this is just, it's limited by my experience. I've used Lanier. I've also used what used to be called Houston Baptist University, and it's now Houston Christian University. Unfortunately, a lot of their books are now online rather than, I've got a prejudice against online. Okay. I mean, I like online, but there's nothing that beats sitting in an easy chair, sitting at a desk and reading a real book. But they have real books, and they have stuff online. So, and I know that you can go in as a visitor and use their resources, and at other schools around you can. And as I said, I'll look around. I've got a list of online resources. One of them that comes to mind, it'll be in this list. Some of you will be familiar with BibleGateway.com. But you may not be aware that there are not, it's not just a concordance. Just pick out your translation, whatever your translation is, they'll list things. But they also have Bible study resources. I think some of them cost something now, but some of them are free. And I haven't checked recently, but there's a set of commentaries called the NIV New Testament commentaries. I think is what they're called. Small volumes, easy to read. They're not exactly popular level, but they tend that direction. Some very excellent scholars worked on many of these books. And to my surprise, this set was still in print, but they made them available at Bible Gateway. So I would check those out. The only disadvantage is they don't tell you who the authors are. I don't know why they don't do that, but they don't tell you who the authors are. But you could find that online if you want to know who wrote the one on Luke or Revelation or whatever. You can find out the information, but they don't tell you there. But I will look for other online resources. So libraries, online resources. Let's see. Church libraries, preacher's library, or friends that might have commentaries on certain books that you're working on. So there are ways to do it without breaking the bank. Yeah, eBay. Some of you may not like Amazon, but eBay and Amazon both, you can find a lot of books for really good used books for good prices. And Carla mentioned Lanier also has free lectures. They bring in biblical scholars to lecture on different things. I heard one lecture on, I think the title was God the Warrior, and it was by Tremper Longman III. Incredible. It was just, it was an incredible presentation, and they've had a lot of really good people there. Okay. Let me just mention two other things quickly because we've gone longer than I thought we would. I thought this was going to be a short evening, but I get to talking about this stuff and You already started when you were studying the text alone. Now you continue thinking about how the text applies to your life. We never want to get away from that. This isn't just intellectual. In a sense, knowing who Jesus is and knowing his power and his deity is lesson enough within itself. But that's not the end result. He saves us. He also molds us into his disciples. And to be his disciple means that we're learning to be like him. And so there's no end to application to the way I think about myself, the way I think about God, the way I think about the people around me, the way I treat the people around me, what my priorities, what I choose to do, what I choose not to do. And we're going to come back to the idea of application, but I'm throwing it out here. And then we end where we began in this process. We began with prayer, praying for understanding and for openness. And at the end, I encourage you, at the end of the study, pray for understanding and openness. In the end, while biblical study is one of the greatest blessings of my life, simply studying for the sake of knowledge is not the end. The end result must be becoming increasingly more like Jesus and being transformed into his likeness, which is the very image of the Heavenly Father. Okay, let's pray together. Our Father, we ask that you'll be with us and that you will help us to understand your word in all of its depth and all of its beauty and all of its glory, realizing that it comes from you and and through this text you are speaking to us. Help us, Father, not only to understand, but to be open to its message, to transform our lives, to make us into the kind of people that you always envisioned that we should be. Help us, Father, to be true disciples, truly becoming the vision of what we see when we see you in Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. Thank you. Thank you for being with me this evening and joining
Thank
us.
you.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.